The wireless operator's hands were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion. 71.5 hours she'd been riding that bicycle through occupied France, pedaling through darkness and dawn and darkness again, her legs screaming with every turn of the crank. 500 kilometers, no gears, just iron will and a message that had to get through. It was June of 1944, and somewhere in the forests of the Auvergne region in central France, the Gestapo's most wanted person was completing what should have been impossible. They called her the White Mouse. The nickname started as a compliment from the Nazis themselves, their grudging acknowledgement that no matter how tight the trap, no matter how many agents they sent it, no matter how many checkpoints they established across southern France, she always slipped through. Like smoke, like a ghost, like something that simply refused to be caught. By June of 1944, the bounty on her head had reached 5 million francs, the highest price the Gestapo had ever placed on any Allied agent in France. 5 million francs for one woman, who at that very moment was disguised as a peasant farmer, her SOE-issued Sten gun hidden beneath baguettes and vegetables, cycling through German roadblocks with nothing but a smile and flawless French to protect her. Her name was Nancy Wake, and before the war ended, she would lead 7,000 resistance fighters, personally coordinate weapons drops worth millions of pounds, engage in firefights that pinned down entire German divisions, and never, not once again. But that June morning in 1944, as she finally reached the destination after that marathon ride through enemy territory, with her muscles cramping and her civilian clothes soaked with sweat, Nancy Wake had no idea that the message she carried would change the course of the French resistance, or that the decision she'd made 72 hours earlier had just saved the lives of hundreds of men who'd come to call her Madame André, the woman who fought like she had nothing left to lose, because by then she didn't. To understand how an Australian woman became the Gestapo's most wanted person in occupied France, you have to go back to Vienna in 1933. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was 21 years old, working as a journalist for the Hearst newspaper empire, and witnessing something that would shape everything that followed. She watched as Nazi gangs dragged Jewish families into the streets, beating them while crowds either cheered or looked away. She saw elderly men forced to scrub sidewalks with toothbrushes while SA officers laughed. She saw the future, and she despised it with an intensity that would fuel 5 years of clandestine warfare. I resolved then and there, she would later say, that if ever the opportunity arose, I would do everything in my power to make things as difficult as possible for that little Austrian corporal and his abominable doctrine. She had no idea that opportunity would arrive with a wedding ring. In 1937, Nancy met Henri Edmond Fiocca, a wealthy French industrialist based in Marseille, handsome, sophisticated, politically connected. They married, and by 1940, Nancy was living the glamorous life of a Marseille socialite, hosting dinner parties at their apartment on Rue Edouard Stephen, driving a Bugatti through the sun-drenched streets of southern France. Then May of 1940 happened, and the German Wehrmacht tore through French defenses like tissue paper. When France fell and the armistice divided the nation into occupied and unoccupied zones, Nancy made a choice that would define the rest of her life. While Marseille fell into the so-called free zone under Vichy control, it became a crossroads, a last stop for Allied airmen shot down over France, for escaped prisoners of war, for refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. They all needed one thing, a way out. Nancy Wake became an ambulance driver by day. By night, she became something far more dangerous. She joined an escape network called the Pat O'Leary Line, named after its leader, Lieutenant Commander Albert Guéris of the Royal Navy, who operated under the alias Pat O'Leary. The network's mission was deceptively simple and impossibly dangerous: smuggle Allied personnel and refugees from France through Spain and back to England, where they could rejoin the war. Nancy's job? Courier. She would transport false identity papers, British currency, and coded messages across checkpoints swarming with Vichy police and Gestapo informants. She would hide down RAF pilots in safe houses across Marseille, then escort them on the first leg of their journey to freedom. She did this not with a gun, but with her most effective weapon, her personality. See, Nancy Wake looked exactly like what she was pretending to be: a wealthy, flirtatious socialite with impeccable fashion sense and a dazzling smile. When German officers stopped her at checkpoints, she didn't act nervous. She flirted. She laughed. She spoke German with a charming accent and French like a native. She carried herself with such breezy confidence that suspicion simply evaporated. But make no mistake, this wasn't just acting. This was field tradecraft at its finest. And between 1940 and 1943, Nancy Wake and the Pat O'Leary network helped over 1,000 Allied personnel escape occupied France. 1,000. The Gestapo began to notice. Reports started filtering up through German intelligence channels about a woman they couldn't identify. Someone with multiple names, multiple safe houses, connections throughout the Marseille underworld, and the upper-class social scene. Someone who moved through their net like water through a sieve. The more they searched, the more she seemed to vanish. They started calling her the White Mouse, frustration disguised as a nickname. By early 1943, the reward for information leading to her capture had climbed to 5 million francs. To put that in perspective, that was more than the annual salary of 50 French factory workers. The Gestapo wanted her badly enough to bankrupt informants with temptation. But Nancy had bigger problems than her growing fame. The Pat O'Leary network had been compromised. In November of 1942, a trader named Roger Le Nevieux, codenamed Roger the Legionnaire, began feeding information to the Gestapo. Safe houses were raided, couriers disappeared, agents were arrested, interrogated, and sent to concentration camps or executed. Henri Fiocca pulled Nancy aside in their Marseille apartment. His face was grim, his voice urgent. "You have to leave, Nancy. Now. The Gestapo knows who you are. They're coming." Nancy shook her head. There were still men to evacuate, networks to preserve. "Not yet," she told him. "One more run." That run nearly became her last. In late March of 1943, Nancy was arrested by Vichy police in Toulouse while attempting to transport documents. They didn't know who she was, just that something about her papers seemed suspicious. They held her for 4 days, questioning her repeatedly, trying to break through the aristocratic facade. Nancy, exhausted and terrified but never showing it, stuck to her cover story with absolute precision. She was just a socialite traveling to visit friends. The documents, a misunderstanding. Surely these nice officers could see she was no threat. She smiled, she charmed, she waited. After 4 agonizing days, they released her, still not realizing they had just let the White Mouse walk out of their interrogation room. But Nancy knew her luck had finally run out. The net was closing. Henri practically begged her, "Go, I'll close down the factory, liquidate assets, and follow you to England within weeks." On April 29, 1943, Nancy Wake kissed her husband goodbye at their apartment in Marseille, then began what would become 6 attempts to cross the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. 6 attempts. The first 5 failed, turned back by border patrols, betrayed by guides, forced to retreat before German search parties could close in. The 6th attempt took her on a 47-hour forced march through the Pyrenees in brutal conditions, climbing mountain passes in darkness, hiding in shepherds' huts, moving with a desperation born from the knowledge that behind her the Gestapo was sweeping through Marseille, making arrests. She made it across, barely, collapsing in Spain, then making her way to the British consulate in Barcelona, then Gibraltar, then finally, after weeks of bureaucratic delays and security vetting, England. Nancy arrived in London in June of 1943, hollow-eyed and haunted, expecting to hear word that Henri had escaped and would join her soon. The word never came. What Nancy didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until after the war ended, was that 6 days after she'd fled Marseille, the Gestapo had kicked in the door of their apartment on Rue Edouard Steven. Henri was home. They arrested him immediately, took him to Gestapo headquarters, and began interrogation. They wanted one piece of information. "Where is your wife?" Henri Fiocca was not a soldier. He was not trained in resistance. He was a businessman who'd fallen in love with an extraordinary woman and supported her work because he believed in her cause. But when the Gestapo tortured him, when they broke bones and applied electrical shocks and did things that left his parents pleading for his release, Henri Fiocca never said a word. He never gave them Nancy's name. He never revealed her contacts. He never broke. And because of that, he never left that building alive. The Gestapo handled his remains to his parents with a warning. This is what happens to those who harbor traitors to the Reich. Nancy would spend 2 years fighting across France, leading thousands of resistance fighters, completing missions that would earn her medals from 4 nations. And she would do all of it, not knowing that the man she loved had already paid the ultimate price for her freedom. But first, she had to convince British intelligence that the most wanted woman in occupied France was worth sending back in. The Special Operations Executive, or SOE, was Britain's wartime answer to unconventional warfare. Formed in July of 1940 on Churchill's orders to set Europe ablaze, the SOE recruited, trained, and deployed agents into occupied territories to organize resistance, conduct sabotage, and gather intelligence. When Nancy Wake walked into SOE headquarters in the summer of 1943 and requested to be sent back into France, she should have been an automatic recruitment. She wasn't. See, Nancy had made a critical mistake. Before approaching the SOE, she'd gone to the Free French Intelligence Services under Colonel Passy, hoping to work with de Gaulle's network. They'd turned her down, citing concerns about her background. That contact raised red flags with British intelligence. If she'd spoken to the French, what else might she have disclosed? Was she compromised? Could she be trusted? For months, Nancy languished in bureaucratic limbo while MI5 ran background checks, interrogated her, verified her story through surviving Pat O'Leary network contacts. Finally, a friend suggested she speak directly to Maurice Buckmaster, the head of SOE's F section, which oversaw operations in France. Nancy later recalled, "I liked him immediately. He didn't waste time with bureaucratic nonsense. He asked me what I'd done, what I wanted to do, and whether I understood I might not come back." Nancy's response was simple. "I understand the risks. Send me back." On October 26, 1943, Nancy Wake officially joined the SOE. What followed was 6 months of the most intensive training the British military could devise. SOE training schools scattered across Scotland and southern England put recruits through hell, testing not just physical ability but psychological resilience, field tradecraft, and the capacity to think under pressure that would crack most people. Documents from the National Archives reveal her training assessments. They're fascinating because they're brutally honest. One instructor noted, "Not a very distingué type of person, but very likable." Another wrote, "Attracted by adventure and excitement, and at times appears to lack a proper sense of seriousness and responsibility." Then came this. Drunk on arrival at Welbeck before Group A party went to station. Withdrawn. Nancy Wake, the woman who'd evaded the Gestapo for 3 years, got pulled from a training course for showing up drunk to a departure briefing. But here's the thing about Nancy. She learned from mistakes and came back harder. Her subsequent reports paint a different picture. In weapons training, very good and fast shot, very keen and obtained good results with all weapons. In fieldcraft, good eye for country, showed great keenness. In close combat, good grasp of principles. In tactics, sound grasp of minor tactics. There's either proved to be an efficient leader and has the power of leading men. That last line is crucial. The SOE wasn't just training Nancy to be a courier anymore. They were training her to lead. In early April of 1944, with D-Day just 2 months away, Nancy received her orders. She would parachute into central France as part of Operation Freelance, a mission to arm and organize Maquis resistance groups in the Auvergne region. Her code name in the field would be Hélène, her cover identity, André, a French woman from Marseille displaced by the war. Her mission objective, link up with Maquis groups, led by a former French army officer named Émile Coulardon, who operated under the alias Colonel Gaspard, and coordinate weapons drops, training, and sabotage operations to support the coming Allied invasion. On the night of April 29th through 30th, 1944, exactly 1 year after she'd kissed Henri goodbye in Marseille, Nancy Wake sat in the cramped fuselage of a Royal Air Force Halifax bomber flying low. She wore civilian clothes, a simple dress, with a fully loaded Webley revolver tucked into her waistband, strapped to her leg, false papers, French francs, a set of coded wireless grenade pill in case. The dispatcher shouted over the end, 2 minutes! Nancy and her partner, another SOE agent named Major John Farmer, who would operate as a radio operator, shuffled toward the jump hole cut into the Halifax's belly. Below, through the darkness, pinpricks of torches blinked from a field near the village of Montluçon in the Allier department. The reception committee, signaling the drop zone was clear. Action stations! Nancy crouched at the edge of the hole. Wind screamed past. Her heart hammered. 3 years of training, 3 years of running, 3 years of loss. All came down to this moment. Go! She jumped. For 10 seconds, she fell through darkness, the slipstream tearing at her clothes, the ground invisible below. Then the parachute deployed with a bone-jarring snap, and suddenly, she was floating down through the night sky over occupied France, heading toward a war she'd promised herself she'd fight. The landing was hard. Nancy hit the ground, rolled, got tangled in her parachute cords for a terrifying moment before Maquis fighters rushed from the tree line to help her up. They were young, most of them, armed with a mix of old hunting rifles and weapons stolen from Vichy Armory. They looked at this woman who'd just fallen from the sky with a mix of awe and uncertainty. One of them asked in rough French, "You are Helene?" Nancy grinned, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "I am, and you're going to show me where Colonel Gaspar is hiding, because we have work to do." Team. What Nancy found in the forests of the Auvergne was both inspiring and terrifying. The Maquis, rural resistance fighters who'd fled into the countryside to avoid forced labor conscription under the Nazi STO program. Numbered in the thousands across the region, they were brave, motivated, and willing to fight. They were also disorganized, poorly armed, and lacking in tactical training. Different groups operated independently, sometimes feuding over territory and resources. Some were communist-aligned, others loyal to de Gaulle's Free French, others simply local farmers and workers who'd had enough. Nancy's job was to turn this chaotic patchwork into a unified fighting force capable of hitting the Germans hard when D-Day came. She established her headquarters at the Château de Fragnier, a rural estate near Montluçon. From there, she began coordinating with Colonel Gaspar and other Maquis leaders, organizing weapons drops from the RAF, distributing supplies, and teaching basic infantry tactics to men who'd never fired a military rifle before. Nancy also discovered something crucial. These men respected action more than words, so she showed them. When weapons drops came in during the night, Halifax and Sterling bombers flying low over the countryside, dropping containers filled with Sten guns, grenades, plastic explosives, and ammunition. Nancy was on the ground with the reception teams hauling heavy containers through muddy fields, organizing distribution, keeping detailed records. When German patrols approached Maquis camps, Nancy didn't hide in the headquarters. She grabbed a Sten gun and joined the ambush parties, firing from cover alongside farmers and students half her age. And when local Maquis leaders tried to dismiss her orders because she was a woman, Nancy shut them down with a combination of fluent French profanity and tactical competence that left them grudgingly impressed. Within weeks, the scattered Maquis groups of the Auvergne began to coalesce into something resembling an army. Nancy coordinated drops that brought in over 90 tons of weapons and supplies. She organized training camps where ex-soldiers taught the guerrilla warfare tactics. She set up communication networks linking disparate groups. And on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Maquis of the Auvergne were ready. Nancy received coded instructions through London, harass German reinforcements moving north toward the invasion beaches, cut railways, blow bridges, make it as difficult as possible for the Wehrmacht to redeploy forces. What followed was a symphony of coordinated chaos. Maquis teams equipped with plastic explosives from Nancy's weapons drops hit railway lines all across the region, derailing trains carrying tanks and artillery north. Others ambushed German convoys on secondary roads, inflicting casualties and forcing the Wehrmacht to divert troops to protect supply lines. Still others cut telephone lines, destroyed fuel depots, and spread panic through German rear areas. The Auvergne became a no-go zone for small German patrol. Wehrmacht commanders were forced to move reinforcements in large formations under heavy guard, slowing their response to the Normandy landings to a crawl. But the Germans noticed, and they decided to do something about it. On June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, German forces launched a massive counter-resistance operation in the Auvergne. Their target, the Maquis groups that had been causing so much trouble. Their method? Overwhelming force. 22,000 German troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and Luftwaffe aircraft, swept into the Auvergne region with orders to destroy the Maquis once and for all. Nancy Wake was about to face the fight of her life. The first indication that something was wrong came just before dawn on June 10th. A Maquis scout burst into the Château de Fragnier, gasping for breath, terror in his eyes. Germans, he managed, thousands of them, tanks, artillery, they're coming from 3 directions. Nancy grabbed her Sten gun and ran to the observation post on the chateau's upper floor. Through binoculars, she could see dust clouds rising from the roads to the north, east, and south. Not patrols, not convoys, columns, battalion-strength formations moving with the methodical precision of a coordinated assault. The Germans had decided to end the Auvergne Maquis, and they were bringing enough firepower to level entire villages. Colonel Gaspard rushed in behind her, his face grim. "We have maybe 500 men in the immediate area. Most are farmers with hunting rifles. We cannot fight 20,000 Germans in open battle." Nancy lowered the binoculars. "Then we don't fight them in open battle. We hit, we fade, and we buy time for the others to disperse." Get runners to every Maquis camp within 20 kilometers. Tell them to scatter into small groups, hide weapons and supplies, and go to ground until the sweep passes. And us? Gaspar asked. Nancy smiled, but there was no humor in it. We give them a bloody nose so they remember not to come back. What followed over the next week was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare against overwhelming odds. Nancy organized the available Maquis fighters into small mobile units, 10 to 15 men each, armed with whatever weapons they had, and detailed knowledge of the local terrain. These units didn't try to hold ground. They set ambushes along forest trails, fired from cover at German columns, then vanished into the woods before the Wehrmacht could respond with artillery. They booby-trapped roads with mines improvised from plastic explosives. They sniped at officers from concealed positions. They staged diversionary attacks to pull German forces away from hidden camps where civilians and Maquis families were sheltering. Nancy herself led several ambushes. One SOE report later noted, during the attack, Helene behaved in a most outstanding manner. She herself led a section of 10 men after their leader had lost his head, resulting in the unfortunate loss of 4 of them. Under her command were Alonce and Sampson, 2 American liaison officers attached to the Maquis. She led the section to within close range of the enemy, ordered the fire, and withdrew them in good order, which showed exceptional courage and coolness in the face of enemy fire. But courage couldn't stop tanks, and by June 14th, the situation had become desperate. German forces had overrun several Maquis positions. The Chateau de Fragny was no longer safe. Nancy and her team had to evacuate to a secondary base deeper in the forest. Worse, during the chaos of the German sweep, their radio operator's equipment had been damaged beyond repair. The crystals needed to communicate with London were destroyed. This was a catastrophe. Without radio contact, Nancy couldn't coordinate weapons drops, couldn't receive orders, couldn't warn London that the Maquis and the Auvergne were under siege and in danger of being wiped out. The Germans were methodically clearing the region, village by village, forest by forest. Nancy gathered her command staff in a cramped forest safe house, maps spread across a makeshift table, faces hollow from exhaustion and fear. We need a new wireless set and crystals, she said. London can drop them, but only if we can tell them where and when. The nearest functioning SOE wireless station is in Châteauroux. Someone asked the obvious question. How far is Châteauroux? Nancy traced the route on the map. 250 kilometers, maybe more, depending on roadblocks. That's 500 kilometers round trip, Gaspar muttered. Through German-occupied territory, past patrols, checkpoints. Impossible to get a car through without papers that can stand up to Gestapo inspection. Nancy stared at the map for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I'll take a bicycle. The room went silent. 500 kilometers by bicycle to an active German anti-partisan operation, along roads crawling with Wehrmacht patrols and Gestapo officers who had her photograph and a 5 million franc bounty on their head. One of the Maquis leaders started to protest. Madame André, this is insane. We can send someone else, someone local who... Nancy cut him off. You're needed here to keep the resistance organized. I know the recognition codes for the Châteauroux station. I know what information London needs. And she allowed herself a tight smile. The Gestapo is looking for a dangerous resistance leader, not a peasant woman on a bicycle. Before anyone could argue further, Nancy was already planning the route. She left the next morning before dawn, June 15th, 1944. No Sten gun, too conspicuous. Just a small pistol hidden in her clothing, false identity papers identifying her as a farmer's wife from a nearby village, and a basket on the bicycle's handlebars, filled with vegetables to sell at market. Her cover story had stopped. The bicycle was old, heavy, and had no gears. The roads through central France were rough, often little more than dirt tracks between fields. Nancy had already been operating on minimal sleep for weeks, and her body was running on adrenaline and willpower. For the first few hours, she made good time, pedaling through the early morning mist, avoiding main roads where German checkpoints were most common. She navigated by memory and a mental map of the region, taking secondary routes through countryside where she was less likely to encounter patrols. Then the sun came up, and the checkpoints began. The first one was outside the town of Montluçon, manned by bored Vichy police who barely glanced at her papers before waving her through. The second was more serious. Feldgendarmerie, German military police, who studied her documents with cold professionalism. Nancy smiled, chatted about the vegetables she was taking to her sister's family. complained about the rationing. The police checked her papers against the list, found nothing suspicious, and let her pass. The third checkpoint was Gestapo. 2 men in long leather coats standing beside a car with a radio antenna. They flagged her down, and Nancy's heart hammered as she braked to a stop. One of them walked around her bicycle slowly, inspecting it. The other held out his hand for her papers. Nancy handed them over with steady hands, maintaining the character, a tired, slightly annoyed French farm wife who just wanted to get to her destination. The Gestapo officer compared her papers to something in a folder he pulled from the car. For 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours, he scrutinized her face. Nancy knew that if her cover broke here, if he recognized her, there would be no escape. She was exhausted, unarmed, except for a pistol she'd never draw in time, alone on a country road with no backup. Finally, the officer handed back her papers. "Where are you going?" "Châteauroux, monsieur. My sister's family, they need help with the harvest." He studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Go." Nancy pedaled away, her legs feeling like rubber, forcing herself not to speed up, not to show relief. The Gestapo officer watched her disappear around a bend in the road, then returned to his car. He'd just let the white mouse slip through his fingers for what would be the last time. By nightfall of June 15th, Nancy had covered 150 kilometers. Her legs were screaming, her back ached, her hands blistered from gripping the handlebars. She found a barn off the road, hid the bicycle, and collapsed into the hay for a few hours of fitful sleep. She was back on the bicycle before dawn, June 16th. The second day was worse. Her muscles had stiffened overnight, and every pedal stroke was agony. The roads deteriorated into rutted tracks that jarred her spine with every bump. She ran out of water by midday and had to risk stopping at a village well to refill her bottle, where suspicious locals eyed her until she spun a convincing story about fleeing her abusive husband. By evening, she reached Châteauroux. Finding the SOE wireless station took another 2 hours of searching through the town's outskirts, locating the safe house based on coded directions she'd memorized months ago during training. When she finally knocked on the door, 3 rapid knocks, paused 2 more, and gave the recognition code. The operator who answered nearly fell over in shock. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. "How did you get here?" Nancy pushed past him into the safe house, her legs finally giving out as she collapsed into a chair. "I need to send a message to London immediately. The Auvergne-Maquis are under attack. We've lost our wireless, and we need to drop with new equipment and supplies within 48 hours, or the entire network will collapse." The operator stared at her. "You came from the Auvergne? That's over 200 kilometers. 250, Nancy corrected. "And I need to get back with the same information, so send the message now." They transmitted that night. London responded within hours, confirming a supply drop scheduled for June 18th if Nancy could organize a reception committee. They also provided updated intelligence on German movements and orders for other resistance groups. Nancy spent exactly 6 hours in Châteauroux, enough time to eat a proper meal, sleep for a few hours, and memorize the information London had sent. Then, on the morning of June 17th, she got back on the bicycle and started riding back toward the Auvergne. The return journey was a blur of pain and determination. Nancy's body was breaking down, her muscles cramping, her mind fogging with exhaustion. She passed through checkpoints on autopilot, relying on reflex and character training to maintain her cover. German soldiers and Vichy police saw exactly what they expected to see, an exhausted French farm wife struggling to get home. They never saw the most wanted woman in France carrying intelligence that would reshape resistance operations across the region. On June 18th, 71 and a half hours after she'd first climbed onto that bicycle, Nancy Wake rode back into the forest camp outside Montluçon, where Colonel Gaspard and the Marquis were waiting. She dismounted, her legs nearly buckling, her hands frozen into claws from gripping the handlebars for 3 days. Gaspard rushed forward to support her as she swayed. "Madame Andre, you're back. Thank God, we thought." "Drop tonight," Nancy interrupted, her voice hoarse. "Midnight. Coordinates I gave the operator. London sending new wireless equipment, medical supplies, ammunition, and explosives. Tell the men to prepare the reception field and light the signal fires exactly at midnight." Then she finally allowed herself to collapse, and they carried her to a cot where she slept for 14 hours straight. That night, as promised, RAF bombers flew over the drop zone, and parachutes blossomed in the darkness, carrying the equipment that would allow the Auvergne-Maquis to continue their operations. Nancy Wake had just completed one of the most remarkable intelligence courier missions of the entire war. 500 kilometers by bicycle through enemy territory, while being hunted by the Gestapo, delivering and retrieving information that saved the resistance network she'd helped build, and she wasn't finished yet. With communications restored and supplies flowing again, the Marquis of the Auvergne shifted from survival mode to offensive operation. Nancy spent the months following her marathon bicycle ride, coordinating increasingly sophisticated attacks across the region. She organized ambushes that targeted German supply convoys, sabotage missions that destroyed railway infrastructure, and intelligence operations that fed information about German troop movements back to London. The Marquis forces under her coordination grew to an estimated 7,000 fighters spread across multiple groups. Nancy became the liaison who kept these disparate factions working together, distributing weapons, settling disputes, and ensuring that operations supported the overall Allied strategy as the Normandy invasion turned into a full-scale campaign to liberate France. Her reputation among the Marquis became almost legendary. The men called her Madame André, but they spoke of her with an awe usually reserved for career soldiers. She could outshoot most of them, outthink them tactically, and when firefights erupted, she fought alongside them without hesitation. One incident became particularly famous among the resistance fighters. During an ambush against a German patrol, a young Marquis fighter froze under fire. Panicking as bullets tore through the trees around him, Nancy crawled to his position under heavy fire, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him to cover while returning fire with a Sten gun. "If you're going to die," she shouted over the gunfire, "at least do it shooting back." The young man not only survived, but went on to become one of the most reliable fighters in his, telling the story of the crazy Australian woman who'd saved his life. But the work took its toll. Nancy was operating on minimal sleep, subsisting on whatever food the Marquis could scrounge, constantly moving between camps to avoid German sweeps. Her body bore the marks of the war, scars from shrapnel, bruises from rough landings during night drops, persistent exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fully erase. And through it all, she carried the weight of not knowing what had happened to Henri. She'd sent inquiries through SOE channels hoping for word that he'd escaped, that he was safe in England or with the Free French. The replies were always the same: no information available at this time. By August of 1944, the tide of the war had shifted decisively. Allied forces were pushing east from Normandy, and the German occupation of France was collapsing. Resistance groups that had spent years hiding in forests and conducting hit-and-run attacks were now liberating entire towns and cities ahead of the Allied advance. The Auvergne Marquis, battle-hardened and well-equipped after months under Nancy's coordination, played a crucial role in the liberation of central France. They secured key roads for Allied columns, prevented German demolition of bridges and infrastructure, and harassed retreating Wehrmacht units. Nancy herself led Marquis fighters into the town of Montluçon as German forces withdrew, experiencing the surreal joy of seeing French civilians emerge from hiding, the tricolor flag appearing in windows, people crying and cheering as years of occupation finally ended. But victory brought revelations Nancy hadn't prepared. In September of 1944, as SOE began consolidating reports from liberated France and cross-referencing them with Gestapo records captured during the liberation, the truth about Henri Fiocha finally emerged. An SOE officer called Nancy into his office in Paris, his face carefully neutral. "Captain Wake, we've received confirmation regarding your husband." Nancy sat down slowly. She already knew. Somehow, she'd known for months. On some level, she'd refused to acknowledge. "He was arrested in May of 1943, the officer continued quietly. "The Gestapo interrogated him about your whereabouts and your network contacts. According to testimony from another prisoner who survived, Henri refused to provide any information. He endured considerable suffering before passing away in custody." Nancy sat in silence for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Did he give them anything?" "Not a single name, not a single location. The Gestapo records show complete frustration with his lack of cooperation." Nancy nodded once, then stood. "Thank you for the information, Captain. If you will excuse me, I have reports to file." She walked out of that office with the same controlled composure she'd maintained through every checkpoint, every interrogation, every firefight. But later, alone in her quarters, Nancy Grace Augusta Wake finally allowed herself to grieve for the man who'd loved her enough to endure torture and withstand the Gestapo rather than betray her. And then, as she'd done after witnessing Nazi brutality in Vienna, after escaping France across the Pyrenees, after parachuting back into occupied territory, Nancy Wake got back to work. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Nancy Wake stood among the most decorated servicewomen in Allied military history. From the United Kingdom, the George Medal and the 1939 for 1945 Star. From the United States, the Medal of Freedom with bronze palm. From France, she was made a Chevalier, then an officer of the Légion d'honneur, awarded the Croix de Guerre with 2 palms and a star, and received the Médaille de la Résistance. Australia would eventually award her the Companion of the Order of Australia. New Zealand, acknowledging her birthplace, presented her with a badge in gold, but medals didn't define Nancy Wake. After the war, she tried to return to normal life. She ran unsuccessfully for Australian Parliament in 1949 and 1951 as a Liberal candidate. She moved back to London, worked for British intelligence in the Air Ministry, married an RAF officer named John Forward, and eventually retired to Australia in the 1960s. In 1985, she published her autobiography, The White Mouse, which became an international bestseller and introduced a new generation to the story of the resistance fighter who topped the Gestapo's most wanted list. When John Forward passed away in 1997, Nancy sold her medals to raise funds and returned to London, where she spent her final years living in a hotel, occasionally holding court in the bar downstairs, regaling journalists and historians and anyone who'd listened with stories from the war. She was uncompromising, profane, and utterly without false modesty. When asked once how she felt about the men she'd fought against during the war, Nancy reportedly replied, "I have only one thing to say. I eliminated a lot of Germans, and I'm only sorry I didn't account for more." Nancy Wake passed away on August 7, 2011, at Kingston Hospital in London. She was 98 years old. As she'd requested, her ashes were scattered in the woods surrounding the Château de Fragnier near Montluçon, the same forest where she'd coordinated the resistance, where she'd fought alongside farmers and students who'd become soldiers, where she'd earned the loyalty of 7,000 men who'd called her Madame André. The Gestapo had called her the White Mouse because she always slipped through their traps. They'd offered 5 million francs for her capture, deployed thousands of agents to hunt her, studied her methods, tried desperately to predict her movements. They never caught her, not once, not ever. Nancy Wake spent 5 years fighting against Nazi Germany, first as a courier, smuggling Allied personnel to freedom, then as an SOE agent parachuting into occupied France, and finally as a resistance coordinator leading thousands of fighters in guerrilla warfare that helped liberate an entire region of France. She cycled 500 kilometers through enemy territory to deliver a message that saved the Auvergne resistance. She led ambushes against overwhelming German forces with nothing but a Sten gun, an absolute nerve. She organized weapons drops worth millions of pounds and coordinated operations that tied down German divisions during the critical weeks after D-Day. And she did all of it while carrying a grief she never fully expressed for the husband who'd loved her enough to endure torture rather than betray her, for the life they'd planned together in peacetime Marseille, for the price that resistance demanded and that Henri Fiocca paid in full. The Nazis called her the White Mouse. The French resistance called her Madame André. The SOE called her one of the most effective agents of the entire war. History remembers her as Nancy Wake, the woman who made the Gestapo regret every step they took trying to catch her. And to this day, in the forests of the Auvergne, there are people who still tell stories about the Australian woman who fell from the sky, who fought like she had nothing left to lose, and who never ever backed down from a fight worth fighting. Because some traps are meant to be escaped, some battles are meant to be won, and some legends are absolutely undeniably real.